Yeah, help yourself, please. Feel free to.
Yeah,
If you need paper.
I'm fasting today, so.
Okay, gotcha.
So, help yourself. I'm good, thank you. Yeah. You know, I admire you fasting. I think it's good. We can think more clearly.
Yes. Yeah, I do fast. Yeah, every week.
Every week?
Yeah.
Once a week?
Yeah.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. Good. I'm going to officially start here. Okay, so let's begin. Welcome to this really first part of studying the Genjo Koan. And to begin, I'd like to start by talking about who was Eihei Dogen. We call him, you'll hear me referring to him as Dogen, Zen Master Dogen, Dogen Zenji. Those are all terms for Dogen. So I want to begin by thinking about or sharing what I understand of Zen Master Dogen, who he was. There's no secrets to this. You can find a lot about Dogen, thankfully, because he left a lot of information about himself, a lot of writing. And there's this is the particular book that I'm referring to for this class. It's called Realizing Genjo Koan by Shohaku Okamura. I have a lot of respect for him as a bless you, and as a practitioner and as a Buddhist teacher. So many people have opened or started to read Dogen's Shobo Genzo and realize really quickly that they don't understand what it's about or what he's talking about. It's a very common thing, not only for Americans, but also for Japanese who may have lived in, share the same language and the same culture. So one thing we need to think about when we're studying a religious text that is not of our culture and of our time period. There's many ways to study and to read it. And the first way, which is the worst way, is the literal way of reading it. People do this all of the time. They pick up a religious text from an ancient time and think that they're going to understand it by themselves simply by reading it. And it's just not a healthy way, I think, to study religious texts, is this literal way. But people do it all of the time. Think about with the Bible, for example. People will open up to a random page, read it, and think they understand it. And that goes for people who are both religious and atheist or non-religious. I don't want to put atheists in the camp of non-religious, but those who are religious and those who are not religious might think that they can read an ancient text and think they understand it. It's the most common way that we see people trying to understand a text. And it's the most vulgar way to try to understand it, because there's other ways to understand the text. Another way is to understand the historical period in which it was written. What was happening? What was the history of that time? What's the time that it was written? The culture that it was written in, the language that it was written in, the audience that it was written for, who was reading it, who was hearing it, and the person who wrote it. So who wrote it? these are better ways to enter into these other five, or better ways. There may be other ways to think of it too, but these are better ways to begin to study ancient historical or an ancient religious text. And Shobo Genzo is not exactly completely ancient because it was written in the 13th century. Right? We know that is written in the 13th century. And so that's younger than a lot of much older texts like the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita. These go back at least 2,000 years, maybe more. Okay, so what we are going to focus on in this particular part is who wrote the text. We want to learn about the person who actually wrote the Genjo Koan, and that is Dogen. So this is one entrance way into the Genjo Koan. We want to know who was Zen Master Dogen, because if we understand a little bit about who he was, we'll understand why he wrote what he wrote and get some idea of where he was coming from with it. And it's not going to be, we'll be looking at this right now, but it overlaps with the language, the audience, the culture. All of these things are going to be included in that discussion. But we're focusing on the person of Zen Master Dogen. So first, let's look at the cultural context before we understand something about Dogen. Let's look at the time period in which he lived. Okay. So there was. So we're talking about what part of the region, what part of the world we're talking about is Japan in the 13th century, and there is a transition taking place. There's a transition. There is a movement, a historical movement, from what's called the Heian period to the Kamakura period. This was a political movement. So the Heian period is earlier, and Kamakura comes later. So we're moving in this direction from Heian to Kamakura. That's the direction we're moving in. The Heian period is a time where the aristocrats ruled. They are the ruling party in Japan at that time. These are nobles. And the period we're moving into, the Kamakura, it's not so. There's not a strict line between these two. It's a transitional period, and this transitional period is in which Dogen lives. Then the Kamakura period is marked by warlords being in charge. We think about like the samurai, for example, and the daimyo. So there's this transition period from here to here. Who has the power, the political power in Japan? And there's a shifting of power. There's a change. The capital changes from Kyoto to Kamakura. Kamakura, by the way, is where the great Buddha is. There's a huge Buddha statue in Kamakura. Now, interestingly, during this transitional period, the monks, guess who backed the monks?
The aristocrats.
The warlords.
The aristocrats. Yeah. So the monks are actually backed by the aristocracy. Dogen himself was born a noble in the aristocracy. His father He was probably, it looks like he was probably the illegitimate son of an aristocrat. That's very, just to think about that. He was the illegitimate son of an aristocrat. So came from a very powerful background, and his father apparently had a lot of clout within the Japanese government ruling class at that time. He was born in this particular time, into this particular situation. But the fact that the monks were backed by the aristocracy was a big problem. This is an example of the merging of religion and politics, religion and the state. When religion and the state are like this, what happens to religion?
Whatever happens to the state happens to the state.
And it corrupts. It corrupts religion. When religion and because the government leaders, they are backing the monks. Well, the monks are going to do what the leaders tell them, not necessarily what the teachings of the Buddha Dharma is saying. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly the period of time this was. So the monks are actually, because there's this transition of power, these people are losing power. The monks themselves were power. One way to gain power was to become a monk. It's completely opposite of the Buddha's teachings. It's not about gaining political power. They were losing power, and a way to gain power was before, when it was clearly a Heian period, was to become a monk. That could be, you can rise up through the ranks as a monk. So you have the emergence of these warrior monks because they're fighting. They're fighting this transition from this transition of power from the aristocracy to the warlords. These monks they're marked by, they don't practice, to be frank. They don't practice meditation.
What do they do?
That's a good question. What do they do? And this is part of the reason why Dogen, when we're reading Dogen's writing, we've got to keep this in mind that he's been brought up in this situation where the aristocracy is losing power. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's find out more about this particular historical period. So the main point here is that Buddhism at this period of time becomes a means to power. To practice Buddhism, it becomes a means to power by the ruling class, the emperor, the aristocracy. It was a means to attain worldly power. Everybody in the population they sought out prayers in order to prevent disasters and to generate good fortune. That was the point of Buddhism at that time, to prevent disasters. They believed that is kind of a magical belief, preventing disasters and generating income or fortune. And elaborate rituals were conducted for those purposes. All right. So this becomes it's a popular movement within Buddhism. It's very popular. But the problem was that the true religiousness of Buddhism was waning. It was lost. So the monks at that time, they didn't practice meditation. They associated with people lacking virtue. There's a whole list of things that they didn't do or that they did. They had worldly careers in addition to the being monks. They indulged in drinking and excessive sexual pleasure. They associated with the nobility in order to further their careers. They were concerned with wearing gaudy robes. This was the critique of that particular time. All right, so now let's move into Dogen. He was born into this particular historical period, this time. And in some ways, his birth mirrors the Buddha's in that he's born into a noble family, just as the Buddha was born as the son of a prince. And like the Buddha, he loses there's two accounts. His father, in one account, is said to have died when he was 2. In another account, to have died when maybe after he returned from China. Dogen would have been in his late 20s when his father passed away. And his mother died when he was 7 years old. This is a really important point because whether he had his father dying at age 2 or age 27, his father wasn't in the picture. He was raised by an uncle at the age of 7 when his mother passes away. The interesting thing about his mother was that her dying wish, apparently, was that Dogen become a monk. She wanted him to become a monk. This is very interesting.
Would that be like my grandmother's dying wish would be for me to be a doctor or something because monks had power or something?
Yeah,
It's like I want you to be a doctor or a dentist or something.
The way to be a social climber was to be a monk or to, gain power.
But I think she was, the sense that I've gotten, I could be wrong on this, the sense that I've gotten was that his mother had a deeper sense of Buddhism than this climbing of to power, position of power. This is a time, at 7 years old, he experiences the truth of impermanence. This real deep sense of impermanence pervades his life at that time. And in that moment, his mother saying, "My dying wish is for you to become a monk." Now, when he was brought up by his uncle had different plans for him. His uncle didn't have an heir. His uncle didn't have a son. And so his uncle raised him to be his heir. And so consequently, even at a younger age than that, he is educated most likely in the Chinese and Japanese classics. Now you can read that as Confucianism. He was probably well versed in the Confucian classics. And some say, I think, at age 2, he was already able to read and study. So he was quite precocious young boy. There's a from his own words, Dogen Zenji writes about his upbringing. Let me read it to you. He says, "As a result of my predilection for study from childhood, I am prone, even now, to examine the rhetorical expressions of non-Buddhist classics." Again, these are the Confucian books. "And to consult the Wen Xuan, an anthology of classical prose and verses," again, Confucian, I'm guessing. And then he says, "But I believe that such a thing is irrelevant and should be discarded once and for all." So he admits to his deep study of classical Chinese texts, notably these Confucian classics. But this lays the groundwork for his extensive writing. If he hadn't studied the way he did and the systematic study the way that he did, he probably would not have been able to write and communicate with the facility that he has and the magnanimity with which he has. He probably wouldn't have been able to do that, is my guess. But he studied these things really, really extensively from a young age, like most people. And especially if you're an aristocrat in that class, you've got to study and understand these. You've got to learn these things. And in many ways, it mirrors what happens in culture, where there's the cultural water that we swim in. So in America, in the United States, we swim in a cultural water of predominantly Christian ways of thinking about the world. And like Dogen you see him rejecting this. And as he takes on this role as a Buddhist monk. In a very similar way, non-Buddhists might come to Buddhism rejecting their Christian upbringing, right? Or you can think about your own culture in that way. That oftentimes there's things about it that actually about our own culture that prevent us from really growing more deeply, or maybe they're meant to liberate us, but they do just the opposite. They imprison us. And because it becomes so culturally ingrained, we just, sometimes people just accept it. I think Dogen is living in this particular time period where it was just accepted that this is the way things are. And Buddhism wasn't really taken seriously either, as far as a religious path to liberation.
What was the dominant religious practice in Japan at the time? Was it Buddhism?
Well, instead of thinking about that, maybe we can think about just a general way of being.
Okay.
That didn't have we want to place things into like, what was the religion? Mm-hmm. I don't think like looking through a religion lens is a very Western way of thinking about it. And I don't think it's a helpful way when we think about Japan at this particular time period. There's certainly Buddhism was active. You also have Shinto, which is the native religion, and then also Confucianism. So in a sense, he's reacting against maybe some Confucian ways of seeing the world, but he doesn't completely reject them, because you see he refers to Confucian concepts, and I've mentioned this in other places, but he refers to Confucian concepts in explaining the Dharma, the Buddha Dharma, or in talking about the Buddha Dharma. And in the same way, I think in this country, Buddhist teachers will often refer to Christian teachings in order to explain the Buddhist teachings. Right? There's an overlap there. It's not black and white. So his mother's influence, and we can also say that his mother saying, go and be a monk, and Dogen saying, okay, I'm going to do that, is a form of what in Confucianism would be referred to as filial piety. He was simply doing the duty that his mother wanted him to do. He was fulfilling that duty to be a filial son. He lost his mother, so even in her death, he was acting out of a very Confucian principle by becoming a monk, by becoming a Buddhist. Just think about that. He was acting out of a very Confucian principle by becoming a monk. I remember my teacher sharing a story of the Hmong people. I think they're in Burma. I think they're in maybe in that region of the world. The Hmong, I think,
Yeah.
Hmong
Yep.
people. And this was a story my teacher shared with us. So I don't know how accurate it is, but I take it as fairly accurate. The Hmong people, they came to the United States and they were sponsored by a Christian they're Buddhist. They're Buddhist culturally Buddhist. And they came to the United States and they were sponsored by a Christian church. And after maybe some months or some years of living in the United States, they all wholesale converted to Christianity. And my teacher's response to that was the most Buddhist thing they could do.
Really?
Convert to Christianity.
Hmm.
Why? Because they were repaying the debt that they felt they owed the people that had taken care of them. They were repaying a debt. Right? That was a Buddhist thing for them to do. Now, so we can't always say like, what we want to put people into boxes. This is a Christian. This is a Buddhist. It's not that simple. It's not that simple. Right? And in Japan, you're off in modern times. You celebrate the Shinto holidays, the Shinto celebrations. Shinto is more celebratory. You die with a Buddhist funeral. You're wed with a Shinto ceremony often, and your ethical system comes from Confucianism. So your daily life is based oftentimes in Confucian ethics. All three of those things are happening simultaneously in the life of a Japanese. And yet when I would ask Japanese, what's your religion? Inevitably, their response was, oh, I don't believe in religion. And it was true, right? It's not something that you have to go and say, their primary identity was Japanese. I am Japanese. I'm not Buddhist. I'm not Shinto. But meanwhile, they would celebrate Shinto. That would be part of Buddhist memorial services or funeral services, and they would their ethical system that they would base their way of living on is Confucian. If you just scratch the surface, it's all right there.
Now they buy presents for Christmas too.
Right, and celebrate Jesus's birthday.
Celebrate
In the Buddhist
consumerism.
temples, they get a birthday cake on Christmas.
No way.
It's a very Buddhist thing to do.
The Buddhism is not a religion. I don't think it's a religion. It's a practice.
It's a practice, right. I think in our country, we want to say, if you are Buddhist, then you believe such and such. But that's not really what Buddhism is about. It's a practice. We go into the Zendo and place our hands together and bow, not because we believe in the Buddha, but because that's a practice, is a practice of humility. It's a practice of interdependence, of interpenetration, that when we bow to the Buddha, we are also seeing the Buddha in our own heart. We're acknowledging the Buddha's here as well as over there. And the Buddha is in each one of us, each one of you, in our hearts, whenever we bow. That's a practice, it's not a belief. We're just practicing that. You don't have to be Buddhist or become Buddhist. That's not the point here. Okay, so back to Dogen. At the age of 13, he's confronted with maybe what might have been considered a difficult choice. Do I follow the path my uncle wants for me? Or do I study as a monk? He happens to have another uncle that's related to his mother, who's a monk. And he has a consultation with him on what he should do. And this other uncle, who's a monk, suggests that he study at Mount Hiezan. And this is where all the monks of that day practiced and studied and trained. Mount Hiezan is a Tendai Buddhist monastery complex. It's a complex of various buildings with. So it was the place to study. It was the place to study in that time and age. So inevitably, he had probably most like, and this is at 13 years. He's 13 years old, so he's a young boy when he becomes a monk. He ordains as a monk. And most likely he was involved as a young boy in systematic study of the sutras. That is the Tendai Buddhist way. Unlike the majority of that time that saw impermanence, this idea of impermanence, as a form of fatalism or pessimism. He sees it as a means to wake up, a means to increasing one's vitality. Think about it. Impermanence, maybe we take it for granted in the Zen Center. We say, wake up, life is impermanent, it's short. And that's a call for us to, take it seriously and really think deeply about what we're doing. But in the time of Dogen, this reality of impermanence led people a different direction. They saw impermanence as a confirmation of fatalism, that we're destined to do it, to live in this way. And there's no change in that particular way of thinking. You get stuck into one way of thinking, even if it's a way that leads to more suffering. It's impermanence, right? Or that was the way of thinking, or pessimism even. And so in the time of Dogen, there's this, actually in Buddhism in general, there's this idea that time can be separated into 3 periods. The time of there's 3 periods of time. Okay, the first period is the period of the true Dharma. And then the next period, you guys know this one? Do you know this one? Showed you the name of the second period?
No, this sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah, this is the first period of time. This is the time in which the Buddha actually lived, and that practitioners could attain enlightenment. That it was believed that the time of the true Dharma, and it lasts maybe 500 years after the Buddha's death. Went for about, and then came the time of the, what is the word for it? There's a word, it kind of like, I don't know the word for it right now, but like the echo of the Dharma. And I'll just use the word echo Dharma. That it wasn't that people would practice, but it wouldn't lead to enlightenment. It was beginning to decay, and this went on for the next 500 to 1,000 years. And then the third period is called the age of the decay of the Dharma, or Mappo. Mappo in Roman letters. Mappo. Now, this would be, if you think about it, it was believed in Japan at the time of Dogen that they had entered into the decay of the Dharma. Mappo. The Dharma was, you couldn't possibly, people can't hear the Dharma anymore. They can't practice it. And society is in a general place of degeneration. And so you combine that with ideas of fatalism. You can't study the Dharma, you can't attain enlightenment. in this time because we're in this age. In this age, it's impossible to do that. That was the belief in that particular period. So people would go through the rituals, but they wouldn't really believe in the Buddha's teachings because they were in Mappo, and the Buddha's teachings could not be realized in that time. However, this, you know how true Dharma, and if you put that in Japanese, you know what that is? Put it in Japanese and you get sho. This is Mappo. Po means Dharma. If you put it here, it becomes sho bo. And this is a pointer to Dogen's Shobo Genzo. It's the same Chinese character here. Shobo is means the age of the true Dharma. So Dogen is reacting to this false idea that we live in the age of the decaying Dharma, where you can't hear the Buddha's teachings, you can't attain enlightenment in this lifetime. He's responding to this widely held belief that we live in this particular age and it's impossible to really practice the Buddha's teaching. He writes the name of his masterpiece is called the Shobo Genzo, the treasury of the true Dharma I, Shobo. The true Dharma can be attained in this lifetime. Dogen said, we're living in this time, not this time. Right? So this is an example of why we need to understand a little bit about the history of time in which Dogen is writing from. He's writing in an age where people think that it's okay to do whatever you want. So there's two things happening here. When he's studying Tendai Buddhism, there's two concepts that he's learning. And as a young boy who might be, I don't know, naive about worldly power to some degree, or maybe he is aware of it, but he's also experiencing the truth of impermanence with the loss of his primary caregiver, his mother, and he's also steeped in Buddhist teachings, and he's wondering, like, how do I address this sense of impermanence that I feel so deeply? He's studying two things in Tendai Buddhism that lead him to ask a particular very important question. All right, the one is so in Tendai Buddhism, there's the idea of Hongaku. I'm going to write in some Chinese characters here. Hon means the root. Gaku means enlightenment. Hon, Gaku. There is a belief in Tendai Buddhism that originally we are all endowed with the Buddha's wisdom, with the Buddha's enlightenment. This word means root, right? The root, or the foundation. The foundation of all human beings and all beings is that all of us are endowed with enlightenment, this original enlightenment. All beings are endowed with Hongaku. And this Hongaku it bypasses time. It's been there for eternity. It's an eternal truth. It's been there all along. There is in this Hongaku the unity of opposites. The unity of opposites, good and bad, high and low, up and down, black and white. That's what this gasho means. Gasho means the unity of opposites. When we put our palms together, we're not believing in something, we're just affirming the unity of opposites. I mean, just look at, like, on a physical level, our body is one, and when we bring our palms together, we're affirming that unity, right? There's two. There's the right arm, there's the left arm. We put them together and they're one. It's just affirming that. That's what Hongaku is saying. This is also where the idea of practice and enlightenment are one. They're one. So this idea is not unique to Dogen. This is what he's being taught. And so this is the first concept. This is the first concept. And the problem with this concept in his time was that if we're already enlightened, why do we need to practice? That was a question for him. Because people weren't practicing because they assumed they already were endowed with enlightenment. So in a sense, it gave people an excuse not to actually engage in the practices of the Buddha. Because from the beginning, you're already enlightened. Why bother practicing? That was his question as a young boy. Why do I need to practice then? And he brings this question to some of his teachers in the Tendai school. And they further suggest that he study with a Rinzai teacher that had just come from China. Master Eisai Zenji it was one of the first Zen teacher to come Japanese to bring Chinese Zen in the Rinzai school to Japan. So he goes to Kenninji Monastery to inquire about the way of the Buddha in the Rinzai, through a Rinzai lens. That's more of his story. But so this is the first thing that he's learning. The second thing, which I think is also somewhat interesting to me, is this second concept is Sokushin Butsu, Jobutsu, Sokushin Jobutsu. Is that right? Jobutsu. So Butsu is Buddha, and Shin refers to our physical body. It means the body itself is Buddha. The body itself is Buddha. And this also, it's a profound religious concept, but it gave people permission to think that whatever they do with their body, it's Buddha. Mm-hmm. So they could do anything they want and be Buddha. They can get away with anything, right? That was the predominant view of that time. So these two concepts, Sokushin Jobutsu and Hongaku, these are prevalent in that time, and Dogen is wondering what's the point of practice if these are because there's a deep kind of complacency that has set in the society. Okay, long story short, there's more to share here, but long story short, because I'll stop here, is that it pressures him to go to China to study Zen and Buddhism in China, and eventually bring it back to Japan. All right, and he comes back with what he describes as a more authentic and real version of Buddhism, and he's highly, highly critical. So we can read that in his writings. He is very critical of the Buddhism of his particular time period after he emerges from China and meets his own Zen master there. All right. Okay, so let's end there, and we'll get back to our seats and sit for a little bit. Thank you.